Hello, Joseph. Hope you're doing well. I just want to read from one of your responses. The response, how does Paul's use of boasting legitimately without, how does Paul use boasting legitimately without undermining his own principles? The primary reason Paul's boasting does not conflict with the principles he worked so hard to build up in the Corinthians is because while boasting about his, quote, pedigree, he constantly shifts the focus and praise to God. Agreed. This makes the self-praise palatable to the listeners who would otherwise have found his self-aggrandizing to be uncouth. By focusing on the power of God at work and commending the Corinthians where appropriate in the midst of his boasting, Paul upholds the social conventions of his day and similarly ours. Not sure about the latter part of what you say there. It's much more specific than that. One of the difficulties that we've got is that we're sort of getting we're looking at a telephone conversation, of course, and we've only got one end of the conversation, and that is the letter that we've got where we've got Paul's response. And so we then surmise what the other end of the conversation is, and that is the Corinthians in terms of what their response is, or rather Paul's response to the situation that they're dealing with. And the element of what I tried to do when I was looking at this in terms of Paul's boasting is to say, why is he boasting? And then because I've always been shocked by, you read the terrible situation that's going on in 1 Corinthians, all that mess that I tried in my response a few days ago to sort of put a box together and put a bow on it and tie it together with one overarching principle, as you know, some Hellenistic, Greek, proto-Gnostic notion that would tie a lot of the problems together in Corinth. And then you read the first part of 2 Corinthians up to about chapter 8, and you think, oh, things have sort of improved there, maybe even to chapter 9. And you think the situation has been sorted out and that things are on the go. Now, I'm not dealing with how many letters Paul wrote, whether it was 2 or whether it was 4 letters and so forth. I'm just taking a plain sense of what we've got. And here, then you get to chapter 10 and you think, whoa, what is going on here? Who are these super apostles? And Paul calling them agents of Satan who are, masquerading as angels of light and so forth. And the letter ends in such a seemingly element of failure, in the sense that some new problem has suddenly arisen that Paul is going to great lengths to deal with. So what I tried to do when I came across that was first of all, I was shocked by the severity of the issue that Paul deals with at the end of the letter, where I couldn't tie it together initially, and still now find it difficult to recognize just how difficult Paul's situation was in Corinth. And of course it got worse, because by the time he gets to Jerusalem, then he's going to find himself ending up in Rome in a very difficult situation after spending much time on the coast in prison and so forth, and then have a tortuous journey that eventually does get him in Rome, according to Acts. So what I did was looked at boasting from the standpoint of the super apostles, of why Paul is reduced to boasting in chapters 10 through 13. And I tried to sort of imagine that I was reading or listening to the telephone, the other end of the telephone, of what Paul was saying about the super apostles who were having an effect upon the Corinthians from the standpoint of what Paul was saying about himself as well as the Corinthians in those chapters. And I came up with these conclusions. And then I checked them out with one or two other scholars to see what they thought about these. For example, J. Christian Becker makes the point that 2 Corinthians is not dealing with the Galatian problem of a law-free gospel. In other words, these people who have come from Jerusalem with letters of recommendation are not the people who are the Judaizers of Galatians, of what we've dealt with. Rather, they're complaining that Paul has no apostolic behavior and that really he's a very weak person and doesn't manifest the elements of apostolic behavior whatsoever. That rather his presence is weak. He doesn't present a gospel that is full of glory. He doesn't take a salary and doesn't seem to be a person who presents what I'll call a big Jesus, a Jesus who is glorious and so forth. I'm pulling that from the letters of recommendation that Paul mentions in chapter 3, verse 12 and so forth. And what Becker brings out is the notion that this is by analogy, that these super apostles were sort of the style or ilk of the apostles in the book of Acts, where they're miracle workers. They're sort of heroes with great speeches, and their speeches talk about who Jesus is and have great endings to their stories in the resurrection of Jesus, and cities come to hear them, and those who die are sort of like Tertullian said, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, and so forth. And so they're very powerful leaders, and Paul exhibits none of that. And so therefore Paul can't really be one of the apostles. And the idea is, it's almost like the Jesus they're preaching, the Jesus they're preaching is sort of a Jesus who is, it's almost like if you take the gospel of the book, in the book of Mark. And you know the book of Mark, 16 chapters. If you take the first 8 chapters of Mark, Jesus is a very, very powerful figure. Goes throughout Galilee and so forth, and he's performing miracles and doing great teaching and so on. It's only in the middle of chapter 8, around about verses 27, following in Caesarea Philippi, when Jesus says to the disciples, "Who do you think the Son of Man is?" And Peter makes a reply and so on. "You're the Christ." And then Jesus, for the first time, tells them who he is, that he's the one who is to go to Jerusalem and die and then be raised from the dead. And of course, Peter says, "Don't do that." And Jesus says, "You know, you're of Satan. Get behind me, Satan." And that's in chapter 8. Then chapter 9 in the book of Mark, and then in chapter 10, Jesus says the same thing again. So 3 times Mark tells us, the reader, that Jesus is going to Jerusalem to die. And then we find in chapter 10, then the movement is from Galilee to Judea. And then when you get to chapter 11, we're in Jerusalem. And then for the next 5 chapters, we get the Passion in chapter 14, but we're in Jerusalem. So you have the whole of the Gospel of Mark then in Jerusalem, dealing with the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. So that you have this sort of long, it's like a passion narrative with a long introduction. But you see the 2 halves of it. The first 8 chapters then are the glory of Jesus in his miracle working capacity, and then the whole idea of the crucifixion as we move towards Jerusalem. Well, the idea then is that the super apostles, I'm building this up to say the super apostles, they sort of concentrated upon a Jesus who was the first 8 chapters of Mark. And Paul, who glorified in his humiliation and weakness, glorified in the crucifixion of Jesus. I haven't got time to go through the First Corinthians when he, had to deal with the notion of saying, "I've come preaching a crucified Christ, not a Christ in glory." And because this is interesting, because it's a question of where you put the emphasis. And I think this is the argument that I'm sort of making, is the super apostles put the emphasis upon glory, letters of recommendation, signs and wonders, receiving pay, authenticity from Jerusalem, the place. Who is this Paul? His letters are really strong, but when he's there with you in Corinth, he's really weak. He's really weak. And so he's not the real thing. And so therefore, when I went through chapters 10 through 13, then I noticed those things. For example, in chapter 10, verse 10, his letters are strong, but his presence is weak. Verse 10 of chapter 10. Chapter 11, Paul's saying, these super apostles are preaching a different Jesus. How could Jesus be different? Perhaps in the way that I've mentioned it. So then Paul says, well, let me be a fool, or let me be a fool and let me play their game to you if you want that. It's almost like that Paul is boasting because he's forced by the Corinthian situation to play the fool. And it's a dangerous game because he doesn't want to do that, because he's got no position to boast because of the situation of his own theology, which is a cruciform Christ through which he gets his glory, Galatians 2:20 and so forth. I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless not I live, but Christ lives in me. So there's no room for boasting, but he's going to play the game of boasting, and it's almost like this. He wants to do irony with the Corinthians and say, okay, you want the super apostles to boast in this glorious Christ. Well, I will boast then. But he wants to say, I will boast, but I will boast surreptitiously, because I will boast in my shame, because that's what he's going to do. By shame, I mean he's going to boast in two things. He's going to boast in all the persecutions he went through, all the shipwrecks, all the beatings. Okay, in other words, then that actually exhibits his weakness because of what he suffered. Now you might say, well, but when he boasts about being in the third heaven and paradise and all that, well, that's the very opposite. No, because he says, I was given a thorn in the flesh that kept me under control of it wasn't glorious. It kept me under control. So in other words, it kept me in a situation of extolling my weakness. But in that he was boasting, he was saying, well, I'm trying to play the game with you of being within one of the super apostles, but of course I'm not. And I love it when he says I think it's verse 13, I've forgotten I'm not sure whether it's chapter 12. I think it is chapter 12. He says, forgive me for the wrong that I've done for you, that I wasn't a burden to you. In other words, forgive me for the wrong that I didn't take any money of you, that I wasn't a burden for you. So I should have taken money from you, then I've been a burden to you because I'd taken money from you. Yeah, he's playing a game of irony there. And that's how I've looked at those chapters. In other words, then his boasting is part then of the game that's being played of irony, which he's trying to say to, he's trying to establish his authority, which is an authority that comes out of weakness, that comes out of him elevating the crucifixion of Christ in all its glory, from which his ministry came from, as opposed to elevating a resurrected, glorious Christ that comes from a misappropriation of who Jesus Christ is by these super apostles who get all their authority from their standpoint, from the letters of recommendation that somehow they've manufactured from Jerusalem. And what they've done is then they've put Paul down. All right, thanks.